Usually the recorded version, which goes online, doesn't have those issues if you want to catch up later on YouTube. But I will just jump in here with a couple of announcements and then we'll begin. I'm looking here. It looks like, do you see anything showing up yet? Okay, well, we'll see.
It says active on the phone.
I know. Well, we'll see what happens. I'm just going to launch into just some of the announcements as we begin. And I want to remind everybody that we will not have class on April 27th. I'll be in New York for the Mockingbird Conference. I beat this dead horse every year that's not a COVID year when the conference is actually happening, and so I'll do it again, which is to say if you want to go to New York for a great conference, and you can obviously also skip the breakout sessions or the talks or whatever. Really great speakers as always, and in a great church, Calvary St. George's at around 2nd Avenue and 23rd Street, if you're familiar with Manhattan, really near Gramercy Park and Washington Square Park and all those places. I'll be the opening speaker, but there's a lot of other speakers that are a much bigger deal than I am, and so I encourage you to go to that. If you're looking for a little grace, and a little help, and a little humor in a great city at a great conference, I encourage you to go to this church. You also get to see where J.P. Morgan went to church for a long, long time and was actually a faithful Christian. So that's the song that you didn't hear, but I encourage you to take a look. Like Father, Like Son by Lenny Kravitz, written by Elton John and Tim Rice. And now I want to ask you a question. And welcome online people. Yes, Don.
Sound is muffled.
Sound is muffled. I don't know what to tell you.
I finally got you.
Oh, good.
Here.
Okay, good. Well, I'm not muted. Let me see if I can increase the sound at all. Maybe that I just added another 6 decibels to what the mic is picking up, so hopefully that'll help. But I'm right here next to the mic, so if it's not picking up, I don't know. Okay. Who's had a bad boss? Would you like to tell us about what was the negative behavior and what were the results?
It was for a law firm not in this state. And I don't want to say it was just my boss, the hierarchy decided the best way to motivate people was through humiliation and pitting each other, one against each other, by giving out the golden goat, this little statue for people who didn't have enough hours, for the least number of hours billed.
Wow. Okay, so this amazing story. It was a law firm not in this state, so we're protecting the identities of the guilty.
Yes.
That thought a way to motivate employees would be public shaming by giving a little award called the Golden Goat to anyone who didn't have enough hours. Billable hours. And what was the impact of this humiliation?
Well, I eventually left. But
you left. What else?
It was vicious.
How did it impact morale?
You were not friends with others. You didn't help out others.
You were not friends with others. You didn't help out others because if you helped them increase their billable hours, it increased competition, and instead of collaboration, people actively worked to hurt other people to help themselves. Yes. Okay. Anybody else like to share stories of a bad boss? You want to talk about it?
Started catching little innuendos, and this particular person just said whatever he wanted to say, whether it was to a patient or to me. And one day I just said, "This is it. I don't need to take this." And so I finished up my work and I left.
Take this job and shove it. So you had a boss who said whatever he wanted to say. This was a doctor, said it was a medical practice, said whatever he wanted to say to patients or staff. And I assume these weren't kind things. And also you said that there were sort of sides, are you on the good or the bad?
They all knew I got hired from him.
Okay.
And nobody wanted to work with him.
Nobody wanted to work with him, so they hired you to work with him so they didn't have to work with him. So it was a toxic situation.
They, you know,
You didn't know that, and you got there and found out you were working for Darth Vader. Okay. What I appreciate when I asked if anybody had a bad boss, just the enthusiasm with people volunteered. Like you still sort of feel this viscerally. I've known people that have worked for bosses who change the game plan about every other week. Sort of, this is the direction we're going to go in, and then, I saw this other shiny new thing, and I'm going to chase this for a while, and this is the management strategy for this month, and then we're going to change it. You'll have to learn new buzzwords and vocabulary next month. And so there's all kinds. Anybody have any other bad boss stories you want to share? Okay, you'll keep them to yourself, but I know everybody has them to some extent. And there are some things that were shared just right now that will apply directly to what we're going to talk about today as we turn to 1 Samuel 14:24 through 52. As we do that, let me open us with a prayer, and then we'll jump in. Almighty God, we thank you for the chance to read and study your word today, and help us as we do so that it would be a benefit in our lives, and that we would be able to see how you work and your grace in our lives. And we pray that you would help us wherever we need it, whether that's inside our hearts or minds or in some external circumstance that we're struggling with right now. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so just a little recap last week. Jonathan, so we're in chapter 14 of 1 Samuel. This is the whole book that's going to be about King David and Goliath, but we're not even there yet because we're still dealing with Samuel, the prophet, who appointed Saul as the first king of Israel, and now we're learning about why Saul is not the greatest guy ever. Saul has a son, Jonathan. We met him last week for the first time. Jonathan and his Na'ar, his sort of cadet or lieutenant, his armor bearer, they head into battle alone. They climb up the wall, they attack the Philistines, God gives them victory, and from that, the whole group of Israelites are rallied to battle, and they defeat the Philistines. And we learn that as that battle begins, all these Israelites come out of hiding. They didn't want to fight, and so they were in the caves. We learn that a bunch of Israelites had also gone to fight for the other side. They were fighting for the Philistines because they saw that the Philistines were the bigger, stronger power, and they said, I'm going to bet on the winning horse, and so they deserted their own people, fought for the Philistines. But then when they saw that it was going really badly for the Philistines, opportunists that they were, they switched back to the Hebrew side. And so all these people, the good, the bad, and the ugly, they all fight the Philistines and they win. And so some of the points that we talked about from last week was just the importance of facing a problem directly. As we see the kind of guide for the church in Matthew chapter 18, where Jesus tells Christians to do something that they've never done since. Jesus tells Christians to, when you have an issue with somebody, go directly to that person, as opposed to talking about it with someone else. Or vague booking. Do you know what vague booking is? That is when you post something on Facebook that's directly about someone. You're sort of airing your grievances, but you're not naming the person. You're just like, I just had a situation with someone I'm not going to name. So that's not what Jesus advocates for. He says you should go talk to somebody directly, but we're not good at doing that. Jonathan was good at doing it. He went directly to talk to the Philistines and ends up defeating them. We saw this idea that God is the one who fights the battles, and because of that, God can use traitors and the people I called fraidy cats, the Israelites that were hiding in the caves, as well as the ones that had gone to fight for the other side. God, again, in a demonstration of his grace, uses people that maybe don't deserve to be a part of the plan. Okay, so that's it for our recap, and now let's jump in and read. And as you think about a bad boss, I think you'll see why I asked that question as we read about what Saul does. So we've seen that they've just fought this big battle. Their king and their generals were afraid to fight it. Jonathan snuck off, started the battle, and they end up winning the battle. And that's where we pick up today in verse 24. And the men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day, so Saul had laid an oath on the people. Ooh, hold on. I just realized I didn't put it up on the screen for our... Is it working yet, Donna? Can you tell? All right, I'll put it up on the screen for the folks at home. You guys have extra time to read ahead, read footnotes, and get ready for the quiz at the end of the class. Okay. Well, it's still not pulling up. Okay. Well, there it is up there, but it's not going to be online. People, I'm sorry. I'm having network issues and it's not letting me. If it changes, I'll do it, but now I'll just read aloud. So just listen well. This is how the people of Israel would have heard the lesson because they wouldn't have had their Bibles. All right. And the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day, so Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." So none of the people had tasted food. Now, when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dripping. But no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath, so he put the tip of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. Then one of the people said, "Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food this day.' And the people were faint. Then Jonathan said, 'My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey? How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great.' They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon, and the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, 'Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood.' And he said, 'You have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here.' And Saul said, 'Disperse yourselves among the people, and say to them, Let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here, and eat, and do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood.' So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built the Lord. Then Saul said, 'Let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them.' And they said, 'Do whatever seems good to you.' But the priest said, 'Let us draw near to God here.' And Saul inquired of God, 'Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel?' But he did not answer him that day. And Saul said, 'Come here, all you leaders of the people, and know and see how this sin has arisen today. For as the Lord lives who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die.' But there was not a man among all the people who answered him. Then he said to all Israel, 'You shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side.' And the people said to Saul, 'Do what seems good to you.' Therefore Saul said, 'O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant this day? If this guilt is in me or in Jonathan my son, O Lord God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people, Israel, give Thumin.' And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Then Saul said, 'Cast the lot between me and my son Jonathan.' And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, 'Tell me what you have done.' And Jonathan told him, 'I tasted a little honey with the tip of my staff that was in my hand. Here I am. I will die.' And Saul said, 'God, do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan.' Then the people said to Saul, 'Shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day.' So the people ransomed Jonathan, so that he did not die. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. When Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them, and he did valiantly, and struck the Amalekites, and delivered Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchi-Shua, and the names of his two daughters were these, The name of the firstborn was Merab, and the name of the younger, Michal. And the name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz. And the name of the commander of his army was Abner, the son of Ner, Saul's uncle. Kish was the father of Saul, and Ner, the father of Abner, was the son of Abiel. There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself. Here endeth the lesson. Well, there you go. Honey on the ground. More bad leadership from Saul. What jumps out at you? What's going on here? What questions do you have? What struck you as odd or interesting? And like the Israelites found honey on the ground, I found cookies on the table.
One question I have, my translation was different. And when you read, they was always referring to the people, they just called them the people. But in my translation, they're either called soldiers or troops.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that different?
The word is the people, but in the context, it's definitely soldiers. It's not the whole nation of Israel. It's the people that are doing the fighting. So, literally people, in the context, it's the soldiers or the troops. What translation are you using, Gail? Just out of curiosity.
NRSV.
Okay. Good.
What was the reason for the curse to not eat?
The
before
reason for
night?
the curse. Yeah, great question. Well, this is sort of the situation again, bad management, bad leadership. It says the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. So Saul laid an oath on the people saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it's evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." So he's saying, Jonathan had to lead the charge here. And all these traitors came out of the caves and out from the other side, and we fought, but it wasn't easy. They were hard pressed, meaning it was a hard battle, and maybe their performance wasn't as swift or as devastating as Saul had hoped. And so Saul's way to deal with this is to make it even harder for them. It's a spiteful thing. And it's like the old t-shirt. I was a rower in college, and rowing is one of those sports that's really painful, and the athletes sort of glory in the suffering. They kind of brag about it and they like it. And there was a guy on in my boat who had a t-shirt that said, and I think he felt like this kind of epitomized the suffering that he loved as a rower: "The beatings will continue until morale improves." And that's sort of what Saul's leadership strategy seems to be. You didn't do a good job, and so because of that, I will not give you any food until you have to fight more on an empty stomach. And by the way, as I said last week, I can't help but think in terms of current events. The troops that invaded Ukraine, the Russian troops, were told to pack their dress uniforms because it was supposed to be such a quick victory that they would then be able to parade through the streets of Kyiv in their dress uniforms. And of course, after the joke going around both in Russia and Ukraine now is that the Russian troops are now on day 28 of the 2-day special military operation. And they don't have enough food, and they're being told to continue to basically do what they can even without the food and without the supplies. They're dealing with frostbite now, and morale is very low. And so imagine if you came to these troops who don't have enough food and who their energy is low, and you tell them, "Sorry, you've got nothing, you've got to keep trying to fight more," and pushing them further into the front lines. But that's Saul's idea. And so what's really interesting is that it says that when all the people came to the forest, the Hebrew gives a sense more of as the land slowly became forest. And if you've ever been to Israel, you know this isn't going to be a huge forest with tall trees. I sort of think more about scrubby cedar trees in Cameron Park, or when you get sort of maybe near a source of water, you begin to have these little scrubby trees. And it says, "Behold, there was honey on the ground." Who put the honey there? The bees, but God. Good Bible answer. I mean, ultimately, all things come from the hand of the Lord. But what did God promise about this promised land, the land that they're fighting for? It would be a land flowing with milk and honey. And here it is literally coming true. Something has happened. Maybe a little raccoon went through there and smashed a honeycomb or something like that. But there's honey on the ground. It's a good cookie, Donna. Thank you. So this honey is there. There's actually a lot of honey. Seems to be there's a reason why we talk about winning people with honey, or honey is seen as this big temptation in the Old Testament. If you read Proverbs, everybody knows Proverbs 31. What's Proverbs 31 about? Phil and Dr. Story cannot answer. What is Proverbs? And neither can Tommy. Only ladies can answer. What is Proverbs 31 about? Anyone ever heard it or know of it? The virtuous woman. Yeah. Proverbs 31 says, a virtuous woman is so rare, and who can find one? And my wife, and it goes on to describe this lady who's married and how she's a business owner, and she's executing contracts during the day and selling land at night and weaving at a loom and raising her children and taking care of her husband, and just basically like Beyonce, basically, is what Proverbs 31 is about. But the reason I asked the men not to say and the women, because a lot of times in churches, Proverbs 31 is used as this model that is an impossible standard for women to meet. And there's actually a lot of books that are written about how it's sort of applied inappropriately. I've met many women over the years who have, in sort of Bible discussion context, who've just talked about that passage being used sort of as a club to, you're not good enough, try harder. Interestingly, Proverbs 31 also has a passage, I don't know why churches don't talk about this more, where it says a good king will give the people wine and strong drink to drown their troubles. It's in the Bible. I never heard that in a Baptist church. I don't know why, but the beginning part of Proverbs has a long section about adultery, and it talks about this adulteress, and it says her lips are dripping honey. And so much so that if you listen to the Joshua Tree by U2, this album came out in 1986, I believe, 86, 87, album of the year, and there's a song where Bono sings, I have tasted the honey lips. If you have seen the scandalous cover of the Ohio Players 1970s era album, it shows I was going through my dad's record collection as a kid, and I was like, oh my gosh, is this even allowed to be in the house? But it's a lady sort of dripping with honey. Ohio Players was sort of a funk jazz band. In the Old Testament, Samson gets in trouble for what? Anybody remember? Several things. But he gets in trouble for coming across a carcass that has a honeycomb. Apparently it's been there a long time, and some bees have built a sort of honeycomb, and it's full of honey, and he's hungry, and so he eats the honey straight from the comb. And he gets in trouble because it violates Jewish dietary restrictions. It's touching a dead thing, so it is therefore unclean. And he eats it, and he lies about it. So honey is often seen as a temptation, sort of a symbol for temptation. But here it's seen as it's a temptation, yes, clearly, but it's also God's provision. Because we read how Jonathan eats this honey. He dips the tip of his staff in there. He eats some honey. It says his eyes are brightened. And if you are someone who's ever suffered from a blood sugar crash, or you've seen someone who just their energy is flagging, and then one of the commentaries I read, and I'm looking at my medical professionals here, so that one of the ways you can tell of somebody is, particularly diabetic who has low blood sugar, that their eyes darken. I don't know if you know this, if they covered this in medical school, but the text says that Jonathan's eyes brighten just from getting enough sugar in his bloodstream. And so picture this happening. All the people they've just won a victory. They're really tired. Saul makes it even harder for them, says, you cannot eat anything, but I want you to continue to press the Philistines in battle. They're walking along. They come into this forest area. They find honey, and everybody's sort of looking Like, no, we can't eat this honey because our king gave us this oath. You will die if anybody eats anything. And then they all watch Jonathan, who doesn't know, take some of this honey. Nobody says anything to him. What does that tell you about the mentality of these soldiers, about their leader? What kind of, and I know I'm asking you to kind of guess, and you're terrified that you get it wrong, and you probably have a hunch, and it's probably right. So I just want to tell you that even if you get it wrong, I will not give you the golden goat. I will not publicly shame you. What do you think is the attitude of these soldiers as they're silent in the face of Jonathan eating this honey?
I think they respect him for going out alone and fighting.
They respect him from yeah, maybe. Yeah, it doesn't say. So yeah, they could respect him. Why do you think they don't tell him anything? Maybe they respect him.
It's the king's son.
It's the king's son. Yeah, it's hard to know for sure. I think they absolutely respect him, for sure. And maybe they don't want to tell him not to do anything. But I think that there's some fear. And you see this later on because Saul is asking, we'll see that he wants to go into battle again, and he's asking God, will you give me favor or not? And it says God is silent. And he says, someone has sinned. We're going to find out who sinned. And again, it says nobody said anything. They'd all seen Jonathan eat the honey, but they don't want to give him the bad news. Nobody challenges him when he says, no eating today. So it's continued bad decisions, and nobody wants to speak truth because they're all terrified. And again, I can't help but being deep in the weeds of this Ukraine thing because I'm fascinated by it and praying a lot about it. But there was a Russian general who wrote an article before the invasion about how disastrous an invasion would be. And nevertheless, the invasion took place, and it has been so disastrous. And so there's a lot of people, intelligence inside the Kremlin and inside Ukraine, that are pointing to the reality that nobody wanted to tell Putin this will be disastrous if you do it. Our troops aren't ready. The officer corps is riddled with corruption. We don't maintain our trucks or our tanks well enough. The mud will be so bad in Ukraine when we get there, we'll be stuck to the roads and we'll be easy targets of ambushes. The Ukrainian people do not want to be liberated. There are no Nazis in Ukraine. Like all this sort of stuff. Nobody told him the truth because everybody was scared of him. Alexander Navalny, a businessman who had voiced opposition, has been in prison, just got sentenced to another 9 years. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who's an oligarch who was in power that then began speaking against Putin, who's been in power for 20 years, now rotting away in jail. So that's nobody tells the truth if you have a leader who makes impetuous, bad decisions and clearly doesn't seem to be someone who shows a lot of mercy. And so no one wants to speak up. And sometimes this happens in families. Like nobody wants to say anything. Everybody knows that mom has a problem, or everybody knows that dad has a problem, but nobody wants to say anything because they fear the explosion or the retaliation. And that's what's going on here. So Jonathan eats the honey and nobody wants to say anything because there's this code of silence that's based in fear. And it says, no one put his hand to his mouth because the people feared the oath. They were afraid of Saul. And then, I guess after he eats, they do tell him, and it says Jonathan had not heard. But then one of the people said, your father has strictly charged the people with an oath, and you're accursed. And Jonathan, in his wisdom, in verse 29, says, my father has troubled the land. Jonathan is the first one to sort of say out loud what everybody is thinking, which again shows that Jonathan is a son not like his father. He can see the actions. Saul is shown as someone who makes impetuous decisions, like when he wouldn't wait for Samuel to offer the sacrifice the chapter before. He makes impetuous decisions that he thinks are smart because he's making the decisions. There's some people who think that any decision that he or she makes is a good one simply because they are the one making them. And nobody wants to counter Saul. Nobody challenges. Nobody pushes back. The other thing we see in the rule book of bad leadership, so number one, Saul makes bad decisions that put him in opposition to his people rather than showing that he's with them and supportive of them. And then he makes this decision and fails to communicate it properly because Jonathan doesn't know about it. And when Jonathan finds out, Jonathan says, "My father has troubled the land." And he says, how much better if the people had eaten freely from the spoil that they have found. And he says, "For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great," meaning we've done a little bit. We've defeated some of the Philistines, but not enough. We're not done yet. And the troops need sustenance. They need fuel. They need food. They need to be able to resupply so they can continue. And this is Jonathan sort of going, oh my gosh, what a terrible idea. And this begins to show some of what Samuel prophesied about what it was to have a king. This is what it looks like when God is no longer your king. A flawed, fallible human being. And Saul is clearly someone who's out of step with God. God is the one who's, you almost imagine that God has put the honey on the ground for the troops to find, and it's waiting there. Meanwhile, back at HQ, Saul is saying, nobody's allowed to eat today. And the Lord is like, I just gave you this honey. And so Saul is clearly out of step with God. Nevertheless, they have victory. Verse 31, they strike down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon. And it says, and the people are very faint. So now they're starving. They're on fumes. Has anybody here ever done anything that would be considered an endurance sport? Or have you even been on a long hike? I have a friend who took his kids on a 4-mile hike in Yosemite National Park, and it was sort of a deal where, sure, my kid, 4 miles, it's fine. This guy was a former Marine, and his kids, they were hardy. They play outside a lot, but they didn't plan for the fact that the sun would be beating down on them for the most of the hike as they went up a trail next to a rock face. And so halfway in, they sort of faced this crucial family decision. Do we continue or do we turn around and go back? And they continued, and everybody got very sunburned because they're an extremely pale family. But have you ever been in any sort of endurance sport or something like that? Anything? Marathons, half marathons? Yes.
The first time my son tried to do the 100-mile run down at Huntsville State Park, he didn't wear the right garments. And, like the cotton t-shirt he wore to start out, started getting all hot, sweaty, because he really sweats.
Yeah.
And by the time he wasn't even halfway finished, he was knocking on the door at the motel where we were, because he was so cold and shivering, we had to take all the blankets off both beds to cover him up.
Yeah.
To start getting him warm back up again.
And did he do the race again with proper supplies?
He did, and
Yeah.
the third time he made the 100 miles.
Yeah. So, the story about a 100-mile race and wearing a cotton shirt, which is just about the worst thing you can wear. It gets abrasive, it gets cold, it retains moisture, it doesn't dry quickly. You should have him call me next time before he attempts anything like that. But bringing the proper gear is really, really important. These folks, when it says the people were very faint, this is that feeling that your son might have had at the end of the race, or people that there's the fly and die thing. People start a marathon really fast because they feel great and they have all this adrenaline and excitement, and they're good for the first 10 miles or so, and then you just crash, or you don't get the proper hydration or nutrition along the way. If you've ever had that feeling, it can come from a long day of gardening and forgetting to drink water, but the people are very faint. It says a lot about the determination and grit of these Israelites, that with a bad leader who wouldn't let them eat, nevertheless they still prevailed against the Philistines that day. But then you see what happens in verse 32. It is like me after having, you remember Tommy Lasorda? And he would advertise Slim Fast, those diet shakes. And he would say, a shake for breakfast, a shake for lunch, and a sensible dinner. And he would hold up his pants, they were out here, and he'd show how much weight he lost. So for me, what happens to me is I'll make my smoothie for breakfast, and I'll have a salad for lunch, and then I'll eat an entire pizza for dinner. Because I feel like whatever willpower I had runs out about 3 p.m. And the Israelites have been so good at not eating. They've been following Saul's oath to, we're not going to eat, or if you eat, you're going to die. I will kill you. They go along with that. And then when they finally win this battle, they've captured the land, so there's all these livestock pens around, and they just start grabbing sheep and oxen sort of just willy-nilly, and it's like beef sushi time. I mean, they just are tearing into it. This shows the level of hunger and the abandon. I don't know if you've had an experience like this where you just let there's just chocolate all over your face, or whatever the case may be, like the mayor in Emily. Has anybody seen Emily? There's a mayor in this little French town that forbids eating sweets, and then he finds himself in the display window of the chocolatier, and he's just eating all the chocolate. He wakes up with it all over his face and his hands. So that's what happens here. It's just complete abandon. I was struck. There was another scene like this on This Is Us, the dramedy on NBC, where Kate Pearson, who's sort of struggling with her weight, and she wants to be thinner, and she, as a girl, and she has this little mantra she repeats to herself whenever she thinks she wants to eat something that she knows she shouldn't, and so she's doing this internal battle. And then her brother says this really critical thing at the dinner table, and she just has, forget it, and she just reaches into it's like a Thanksgiving thing, so there's sweet potatoes with all the marshmallow and brown sugar, so she just starts piling it on her plate. And there are moments like this, and you kind of, these are Israelites who know that you're not supposed to eat the blood, because the blood is the life of the animal, and the blood is what was used in atonement, and you're certainly not supposed to eat it raw. And so, but they are this shows kind of, again, the mental state of what these folks were going through. They take all the sheep and oxen and calves, and they just start slaughtering them on the ground. The thing about slaughtering them on the ground is significant, because the reason that you had an altar for these folks, I mean, yes, there was a religious component to it as well, but in order to drain the blood from the animal, you had to have it sort of off the ground. You had to raise it up, and that's what the point of the altar was. And so they're eating them with the blood. And you also see kind of the result here of Saul's command to not do something. Whenever you're told you can't do something or you shouldn't do something, there's almost always this immediate desire to do that thing. And so they were told you can't eat, don't eat. And the sense here is now nighttime has come. So, because he says this is an oath for this day, until you've defeated the enemy. So they defeated him, and so the first thing that happens is they swing back the other way so hard that they start eating raw, bloody meat, which as an Israelite you would never, ever, ever want to do, even as a human. So this should call into mind what St. Paul says in the letter to the Romans, where he says, I didn't know what it was to covet until the law said, thou shalt not covet. And then I was filled with covetous desire. The way St. Paul says it in Romans 5, verse 20, is that the law, the rules, the law increases the trespass. The more somebody nags you to do something, the more you don't want to do it. I'll show them. The more somebody passive-aggressively tries to get you to change something about yourself, the more you don't want to do it. This is why, and the Cosby Show, which Bill Cosby, obviously, I can't even go there. It's tragic what he did to many, many people. There was, but we'll talk about Dr. Huxtable, the fictional character of Dr. Huxtable. Mrs. Huxtable did not let him eat things that were bad for him, and so he was always in the kitchen trying to eat this enormous hoagie sandwich that was sort of on the don't eat list. The law increases the trespass. The curfew, if the curfew is 10 o'clock, the child never comes home at 9:15. 9:59. If you set a boundary, I want to get right up to it, maybe even cross it a little bit. 10:05. Can I have an extra half hour? Can I have an extra 20 minutes? They've done studies. I think Denmark was the only country crazy enough to try this. They had a village where they removed all the speed limit signs, all the stop signs, all the yield signs, all the traffic signs were removed. I guess the village, they all probably signed waivers. We will not sue you when we get hurt. But people drove more safely. People drove slower. People came to a full stop at the intersection. Because they weren't coming to a full stop because the sign said stop. They were coming to a full stop because they didn't want to die. And they couldn't see who was coming in either direction. So common sense sort of took over. But when there's a law, I mean, people, as I'm training my kids to drive, as I'm sure you have done as well, you have to tell them, don't go the speed limit. You have to go about 3 miles over, or you'll be slowing everybody down and creating a dangerous traffic situation, because everybody drives about 3 to 5 miles over the speed limit. So these people have been told not to eat. The second they can eat, they just go berserk and sort of go beyond. They don't wait to cook the meat. They eat it with the blood. They eat it raw. They just are going nuts. And so it's so bad that even Saul, who we've seen is not the most righteous, virtuous person ever, even he says, you can't do this. You're eating with the blood. And he says, get a big stone. Basically make an altar, because that's how you have to kill an animal in order to drain the blood. So he tries to fix the situation, and then now they've eaten, so he wants to go plunder even more stuff. So they've recharged, they've refreshed, they've had their Red Bull, now we're going to go and plunder even more. And he says, the people of Israel say, do whatever seems good to you, which again is another indication that the people are scared to ever tell him no. They are yes men, essentially. The priest, sort of timidly, I imagine, in the corner, be like, let's see what God says. Let's just pray about it for a sec. And Saul then asked, should I go after the Philistines? Will you give them into our hand? And it says, but he did not answer him that day. Verse 37. This is an indication of God's displeasure with Saul because of his rash vow. And so Saul then, in verse 38, starts this thing. What are Urim and Thumin in verse 41? Anyone know? I think we've talked about them in the past. Anybody have a guess about Urim and Thumin? If you have that in your text.
I Googled it.
Yeah, what did it say?
It said that they were probably in a pouch,
Mm-hmm.
and there were little stones,
Mm-hmm.
and one could be like translucent, so that light could shine through it, and that would be that God was speaking to yes for that, and the other one would be a little more opaque.
Yep.
So that would be like God saying no.
Yep. So that's great, and we're not exactly sure if they were clear and if there's pretty much consensus these are stones. This is a divine magic 8-ball, and it's a way. Yes. What's
What verse are you on?
41? Does yours have that in there? The Urim and Thummim.
Those words are not enough.
What? Can you read your verse out loud? I'm curious.
I see it now. Therefore Saul said to the Lord, the God of Israel, give a perfect lot.
Mm.
Then Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped.
Give a perfect lot. Mm-hmm. So that's because nobody knows, no English speaker knows what Urim and Thummim are. And so that's why it says that. Like, your translation is a little bit closer to, let me have a lucky roll of the dice. Because we understand that. We might understand casting lots, Urim and Thummim. And there is some difference between the oldest Hebrew manuscript and the newer Greek translation. By new, I mean like 1,000 years old. Where it says just give Thummim. One version says give Urim and give Thummim. One says just give Thummim. So there's some textual variance there. But the idea is basically the idea is the same. I'm going to roll the dice and show us the truth. Let me see the true thing. The Urim and Thummim are in the ephod. So that pouch somehow was connected to the priestly garment. Some people think it was just a stone painted white and a stone painted black. It's essentially divine things you would use to make a coin toss. Should we go into battle? Heads or tails? Urim or Thumin? Urim and Thummim. Urim sounds like it starts with a U, but in Hebrew it starts with a vowel that's sort of unpronounceable. It's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph. Thummim starts with T, Tau, the last letter of the Greek alphabet. So the stones also sort of say A and Z in English, how we'd use the alphabet. So kind of heads or tails is the idea here. And so they draw lots about whether, they cast lots about whether they should go forward. And there's no answer. So now how do you get no answer? I don't know. Maybe the stones were like white on one side, the second stone was black on the other side, and the other side they were just sort of natural color. And when you flip the stones, if they both landed that, there was sort of no answer. Who knows? But there was some way on these divine rocks, these sort of dice, that it could give no answer. And that's the answer they got, which is supposed to indicate, again, the Lord's displeasure at Saul and his leadership. So Saul says in verse 38, we have to get to the bottom of this. We have to figure out, why is God mad at us? And he says, come here, all leaders of the people. We're going to figure out who's the guilty one. This is like when you come back, when your teacher steps out of the room and she comes back in the classroom and someone has drawn a vulgar picture of the teacher on the chalkboard. And they say, we're going to find out who, or there's a tack on his chair. Something, the students have done something, and the teacher comes back in, and now the whole class will suffer the wrath until we find the perpetrator. And so Saul says, we got to figure out, again, not that self-aware, because he sort of doesn't think it's him, even though he's kind of the problem. But he says, even if it's Jonathan, Jonathan will die. It doesn't say even if it's me. But anyway, so he says, Jonathan and I will be on one side. Everybody else will be on the other side. And if anyone, and we're going to find out who did this. And it says again, so remember, everybody knows Jonathan ate the honey. Saul says, we're going to find out who ate something that has caused God not to answer us because someone is being disobedient. We're going to find out who the culprit is. And everybody says, okay, good idea. And they all line up, just as Saul says, even though they all know exactly who did it. Because this is a fear-based culture. And if you've ever been in a fear-based culture in an institution, if you've been in a teacher in a school where everybody was where the principal led with fear, if you've been in a church where the pastor led with fear and people were terrified of the volcanic eruption, if you have been in a family where fear was sort of a driving thing, if you've been in a law firm where fear was a driving thing, wherever you have worked or lived, if fear is a driving thing, one of the results is nobody ever speaks up. Nobody sticks their neck out because they don't want to get their head chopped off. So if you think you're being an effective leader by scaring people, you're actually harming the organization because no one will ever tell you the truth. And that's what happens here. So Saul says, everybody over here, Jonathan and me on the other side, and again, this verse that comes out, this phrase, again, do what seems good to you. It sounds like a good idea, Saul. Great. And again, they all know what's going to happen. They all know the outcome. It's going to be Jonathan, but nobody wants to say anything. So they go through this long, elaborate process where they likely had to cast the Urim and Thummim for each tribe of Israel, like each division of soldiers. And they finally get to Jonathan, and it says, first it's Saul and Jonathan, and then it's Jonathan, and Jonathan is taken. And so then Saul says, what did you do? And Jonathan tells him, and Jonathan is willing to die. And Saul's like, yep, you got to die. What a great dad. What a great king, what a great leader. Again, Samuel said, you don't want a king because it'll be terrible. And again, it's all coming to coming into reality. So there's a story in the New Testament a little bit like this. The Bible is not big on rash oaths, or even oaths of any kind. This is why Jesus says, do not swear by heaven, do not swear by earth, because it's God's footstool. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. If you're going to say yes, just say yes. If you're going to say no, but don't make an oath. Which is why, actually, there are many Christian traditions that never say the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't know if you knew that. But there's a lot of Christians that don't say that because the Bible is so cautious about saying any oaths. The Mennonite tradition, that's why they don't say the Pledge of Allegiance, for example. Because you never want to pledge to anything other than God. The rash oath that is sort of famous in the New Testament is when King Herod Antipas, not Herod the Great, who was the king when Jesus was born, but his son, who's kind of a king of a smaller region, when Jesus is beginning his ministry, he's put John the Baptist in jail. This is in Luke's gospel, because John the Baptist was saying negative things about this king. So John the Baptist is in jail. At Herod's birthday party, his wife's daughter does some sort of dance, which Herod likes a lot. And he says, "This is the best dance I've ever seen, and name anything you want and I'll give it to you, up to half my kingdom." And her mom, Herod's wife, whispers in her ear, the daughter's ear, "Ask for John the Baptist's head on a platter." And the reason the mom does that is because John the Baptist has been criticizing Herod and her because it's sort of an illegal marriage. She was married to Herod's brother before, and so that's what John has been criticizing. And so Salome, the daughter, says, "I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter," and that king, Herod, is sort of trapped because he's made this public oath. "I'll give you anything you ask for." So he has to, and he used to go visit John, and he liked to talk to him, but now he can't. He has to kill him. So it all happens. So oaths, don't make them. It's dangerous. So Saul's now in a place where he's got to kill his son. But the people, finally, they've reached their limit. They're like you with the take this job and shove it. But they've reached their limit with Saul's bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. The only good thing about Saul's army is Jonathan. He's the reason for their victory. He's the wise one. He's the smart one. And so finally the people say, "Saul, we didn't want to say anything before, but now we have to say something." He says, "Shall Jonathan die, who's worked this great salvation in Israel? He's the best thing we got. Now you want to kill him?" And it says the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. Other translations have rescued. It's not clear. The word can mean ransom. It can mean rescue. It's not clear whether did they offer some sort of atoning sacrifice in Jonathan's place? Was it some sort of financial ransom? That's what we think of when we think of ransom. Jesus says he offers himself as a ransom. It says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's in Mark's gospel. And obviously Jesus didn't pay money. So sometimes ransom can have the sacrificial component. So maybe there was a sacrifice that was made for Jonathan. Or maybe it was just them speaking up and saying, "Look, Saul, this has gone too far. You gotta spare Jonathan's life." But somehow they ransom him. They finally get through to Saul in some way, and they don't kill Jonathan. And he continues his battle. He's successful in pursuing the Philistines. And then we kind of get into this relatively boring summary passage, verse 47, about all the people that Saul defeats and how successful he was. And then it moves on to his genealogy. And now we kind of learn something that we learn that Saul has children more than just Jonathan. He's got 3 sons, and he's got 2 daughters, and he's got these generals and Abner and all that. I would say remember some of those names because you'll see them again, and especially remember the name Michal, sometimes pronounced Michael, not spelled the same way we spell Michael for a man's name, because who knows who Michal is? Anyone? Who will she be? David's first wife. So David, remember David? It's a book about David. We haven't seen anything about David yet, but David is going to marry Michal. So just remember her, and we're going to see more about that. So as we kind of sum up here, before I give my kind of main points, anything that jumps out at you, how would you summarize the meaning of this passage? This has been an interesting story. What do you draw from it about something you would, what would be the main idea? How would you summarize this? There's more than one answer, so you kind of can't get it wrong.
Is this anywhere close to the area where there were continual
Oh, yeah. So is this anywhere close to the area where there are continual battles? Yes, because all of Israel is continually contested. I mean, it mentions, in terms of the enemies that Saul continues to fight, Moab and the Ammonites. This is Jordan. So, yeah, I mean, the Philistines were an area that were on the coast. So you think of Israel as this little strip of land the size of New Jersey. On the coastal side, the western side, you have the Philistines, Tyre, Sidon, all these places. On the eastern side, you have Jordan and the Golan Heights and those areas, and then Syria up there. So, yeah, it's the same area that is continually fought over to this day. All right, so let me give you the...
Good lesson, I think, about
leaders who are afraid to admit their mistakes. Yeah, there are. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that, so I have a couple of takeaways here. And that is certainly one of them. This story definitely reads like a how-to manual, how to be a bad leader. And one of the things we see clearly is that Saul never admits that he was wrong. This whole thing about the food, he doesn't say, oh, it's bad that, he says it's horrible that you're eating this meat in such a fury that you're eating it with the blood in it. That's my mistake because I starved you and then made you continue to fight. He says, no, you're terrible for doing this. We have to build an altar. So he's clearly not the most self-aware person in the world. And it just, you see bad decision after bad decision. It's like the golden goat. I mean, it's you were hard pressed, you didn't fight well I'm going to make it even worse for you. And we see this idea, as I said, the law increases the trespass. The more arbitrary that a rule seems to be, the more people hate it. People, if they see the point of a rule, they tend to be a little bit more compliant with it. But this thing seems so just outside the bounds of common sense to deny people food. So law increases trespass. More demand, more judgment tends to drive people away. And then finally, the confusion and chaos that results from human leadership. This was the warning about having a king. They said we want a king, and we got it. And human beings are suckers for promises of leaders. Every political party on both sides of the aisle, and I'll throw the independents, the anarchists, the Green Party, and the libertarians in it too. Like, everybody says, if you would elect our person, everything will be great. And we always think that it's going to be true. And it never is. There's always confusion, chaos, and limits. Did you have something you want to say, Linda?
Well, no, I was just thinking about how the people didn't stick out their necks, as you used that term, but also, again, people that are protesting in Russia right now are being imprisoned.
Yeah.
It's a great cost if you do stand up. And so and the leader, it can't tolerate another opinion.
Right. The leader can't tolerate another opinion. And that, again, you see so much bad leadership from Saul. The inability to hear another opinion, the culture of fear that he creates, a fear of punishment as opposed to respect, all these sorts of things that make it a really difficult situation. And I think, there's a certain type of book that is very popular where it wants to portray the Bible as a manual for good corporate leadership. There's a book called Jesus CEO and other things like that. And I tend to get a little nauseated when I see that because it sort of misses the point. However, there are lessons for leadership in the scriptures, and clearly you see them here. And I think it's such a contrast to Jesus Christ, who, when he sees people hungry, harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, his response is compassion, and his response is, let's feed these people. And we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish? No problem. We're still going to feed them, so much so that we're going to have leftovers for days. And so there's I think there is wisdom for leadership in the scriptures, and the counterintuitive example we get in Jesus Christ is somebody who puts himself last and puts others first, which is sort of the opposite of Saul. And Jesus has clearly created a culture where people are always telling him the truth. They're always saying, the fact that Peter feels free enough to tell Jesus he's wrong. Remember when Peter confesses Jesus as the Messiah, you're the Christ. And then Jesus says, you're right. And what that means, despite what you have heard, is I am going to be arrested, and I'm going to be crucified, and it's going to be terrible. And I'm going to rise on the third day. And it says that Peter pulled him aside and began to rebuke him. Now that's on Peter. He was definitely wrong. But it says something about Jesus, that he created a culture of trust and friendship among the disciples, so much so that they felt like they could tell Jesus Christ he was wrong. And Jesus' response is not to cast Peter into outer darkness. And he does say, get behind me, Satan, because he realizes that Satan is tempting Jesus through Peter. But he keeps Peter on the leadership team. Doesn't kick him out. So, again, the kind of leader we follow in Christ is not like Saul, who just wants to cut you down and make things hard because he's sort of got a mean streak, which is how many people think God is. And I think it's important to note that the whole kingship drive in Israel failed. The real king we got, Jesus Christ, does not want political leadership or military leadership, but a different kind of leadership of the human heart. And that's why ultimately the drive to sort of restore a messianic kingship politically in Israel and rebuild the temple, which there are people that want to do, is a completely flawed enterprise. And it's based on an improper reading of the book of Revelation. Didn't think I was going to go there, but I am. Because if you look at what happens with the kings in Israel, they're all bad. Even the best one, David, at best, extremely mixed bag. And because it didn't work, that's why we have Jesus Christ, who completely rejects political power and says it's all worthless. It's all going to fall. And what he's after is the kingdom of heaven, not the kingdom of this earth. So that's what we get from 1 Samuel, the end of chapter 14. We'll pick it up next week with chapter 15, and I look forward to it. Let me just close us with a prayer. Dear God, you know where we need help, and that's where we ask your help. In Christ's name, amen. Come tonight for our Lenten series. If you're into that, it'll be a series. We have Dr. Michael Lloyd from Oxford University speaking tonight at 6 p.m. Soup supper, and then the talk. So hope to see you tonight if you're into that sort of thing. See you next week.